Newgate Prison, built in 1188, stood as a symbol of England's darkest side for over 700 years. Located in the heart of London, it was not just a prison, but a place of torture, suffering, and death. Its reputation spread far beyond the walls, a place where the city's most feared criminals, and even those unjustly accused, were thrown into a living nightmare. The prison's origins lie in the reign of King Henry II, who saw the need for a secure holding place for criminals. But Newgate soon became more than just a mere prison. It became a symbol of the state's power and cruelty. Overcrowded and under-resourced, Newgate's conditions deteriorated rapidly. The prison became a breeding ground for disease, malnutrition, and despair. With its walls constantly filled to capacity, prisoners found themselves crammed into tiny damp cells with no proper ventilation and little to no sanitation. What made Newgate particularly infamous was not just the harsh physical conditions, but the terrifying punishments that awaited the prisoners within its walls. Whether it was for petty theft or political dissent, the torture methods that were employed here became legendary for their cruelty and effectiveness in extracting confessions. The public often spoke of Newgate in whispers, with a deep fear of what lay behind its gates. It was a place where the line between life and death was incredibly thin, and many found themselves closer to the latter long before their physical end. In the early centuries of its existence, the prison was also a symbol of public execution and spectacle. When criminals were sentenced to death, their fate often involved a public hanging, or worse, an execution that was not private, but done in front of a crowd. As such, Newgate was more than just a prison. It was a public reminder of what awaited those who dared break the law. The prison housed thieves, murderers, political prisoners, debtors, and even innocent victims of the Crown's wrath. Its reputation was a chilling reminder that anyone, regardless of their background or social standing, could find themselves caught behind its bars. At Newgate Prison, hanging became the most common method of execution, especially for those convicted of serious crimes like theft, murder, and treason. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Newgate was infamous for its public executions, where large crowds gathered to witness the brutal end of many condemned prisoners. Hanging, while considered the standard execution method, had different techniques over time, ranging from the slow and torturous short drop to the more humane long drop. But the hangman's noose at Newgate wasn't just a symbol of death. It was also a reflection of the justice system's attempt to maintain order, deter crime, and impose authority. And among the many who faced the gallows, two executions stand out for their brutality and historical significance: Catherine Wilson and Michael Barrett. Catherine Wilson's story is one of tragedy, deception, and a violent end at the gallows. In 1824, she was accused of murdering her newborn child, a crime she allegedly committed out of fear of punishment for having an illegitimate child. Catherine, who was only 22 years old at the time, had been a domestic servant and was found guilty of infanticide. Her trial at Old Bailey shocked the public for the details it revealed. The court heard how Catherine had buried her infant alive, leaving a trail of evidence that pointed to her as the perpetrator. Despite the gravity of the crime, her age and the fact that she was a young woman did not spare her from the harsh punishment of the time. On December 1st, 1824, Catherine Wilson was led to the gallows at Newgate Prison. She was publicly hanged, an event witnessed by a large crowd eager to see justice served. Her execution was the epitome of the harsh, unforgiving nature of 19th century criminal justice, where even young women were not spared from the brutal reality of the noose. As Catherine stood at the scaffold, a mix of fear and despair overcame her. The public execution was a spectacle meant to serve as a reminder to all that crime would not go unpunished. Her death was quick, but the sorrow and shame of her execution haunted the public's conscience, leaving many to question the morality of such brutal punishments for women, especially for those driven to desperate acts out of circumstance. Another famous hanging at Newgate occurred just a few years later, in 1868, when Michael Barrett, a man convicted of high treason, faced the hangman's noose. Barrett was one of the Fenians, an Irish revolutionary group that sought to end British rule in Ireland. The group was known for its radical methods, including bombings and violence aimed at the British authorities. Barrett's fate was sealed after a bombing in London in 1850-1867. The explosion, which occurred at the Clerkenwell prison in London, was intended to free Irish prisoners, but instead killed several innocent people. Michael Barrett was convicted of being part of the plot and was sentenced to death by hanging. His trial was a public spectacle, and Barrett became the focal point of much debate about political dissent and the treatment of Irish revolutionaries by the British government. The authorities were determined to make an example of him, given the political climate and the growing tensions between Britain and Ireland. On May 26, 1868, Michael Barrett was hanged at Newgate Prison, in front of a crowd that watched in silence. His execution marked the last public hanging at Newgate, as public executions were abolished in the following year. Barrett's execution not only marked the end of an era in British justice, but also highlighted the intensity of the political conflict that existed between Britain and Ireland. The executions of Catherine Wilson and Michael Barrett, though separated by decades, serve as a haunting reminder of the ruthless justice meted out at Newgate Prison. The noose at Newgate was not just a tool of execution. It was a tool of public spectacle used to reinforce the power of the law and the state. While Catherine Wilson's execution highlights the harshness faced by women in a society steeped in moral judgment, Michael Barrett's fate underscores the lengths to which the British government would go to silence political dissent. Both executions, despite their differences in crime, demonstrate the brutal reality of the criminal justice system during the 19th century. They stand as tragic markers of a time when the gallows were a common fate for those found guilty, and the public witnessed death in its most raw and public form. Beheading was once considered one of the more dignified methods of execution, used primarily for nobility or prominent figures accused of high crimes, such as treason. At Newgate Prison, beheading was reserved for those whose crimes were seen as especially significant or politically motivated, and for those of higher social standing. Though it was less common than hanging, beheading was still a part of Newgate's gruesome legacy, serving as a grim reminder of the consequences of challenging the established order. While the execution method itself was swift and intended to be relatively humane, it became a spectacle of its own, often attended by crowds who came to witness the tragic end of those who dared defy the crown. One of the most notorious instances of beheading at Newgate involved the 5 revolutionary ringleaders who were accused of plotting to assassinate members of the British cabinet during a period of political unrest. In the early 19th century, Britain was embroiled in political and social unrest. Revolutionary fervor was sweeping across Europe, fueled by movements like the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. In response to the growing sense of discontent and unrest, a group of radical revolutionaries in London began to form a secret society with the aim of overthrowing the British government. In 1820, a conspiracy known as the Cato Street Conspiracy was uncovered. The plot, named after the street where the conspirators met, was one of the most infamous assassination attempts in British history. The ringleaders of this plot were 5 men who intended to assassinate cabinet members, including the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, and other key figures in the government. Their goal was to destabilize the British political system and spark a revolutionary uprising. The group planned to carry out their attack during a cabinet dinner at number 10 Downing Street. However, the plot was foiled at the last moment when government spies infiltrated the conspiracy, leading to the capture of the men before they could carry out their deadly plan. After their capture, the 5 conspirators John Brunt, James Wilson, William Paul, Richard Tidd, and Thomas Preston were quickly brought to trial. The court proceedings were a spectacle, with the revolutionaries charged with high treason, a crime that carried the most severe punishment. The beheading of the 5 men was carried out publicly at Newgate Prison, with large crowds gathering to witness the executions. On May 5, 1820, the 5 conspirators were led to the scaffold, each of them bound and blindfolded before the executioner's axe was brought down. The beheading took place in front of a large crowd at Newgate. The execution was swift, but for the men facing it, there was no turning back. The axe fell, and with each blow, the conspirators' lives were extinguished. The public witnessed the gruesome end of the would-be assassins, and their executions became a symbol of the government's resolve to protect its power and deter further uprisings.